Senator Ayotte, obviously, as a freshman senator, joined at the same time as Senator Rubio. One of the things for me, who's been in Washington a while, that's most cheers me up the most, honestly, about the Republican Party and conservatism is for all the talk about how the internationalist tradition, the Reaganite tradition is somehow fading, and everyone's now focused entirely on domestic policy. It's really not true, I think, of the younger, the newer members of the Senate and of the House, where there's been real distinctive leadership on foreign and defense policy matters from younger members. And certainly Senator Ayotte has been one of the leaders, especially on the Armed Services Committee, where she's in just a year really made a mark and is in fact the ranking member on, let me get the right committee, right subcommittee here. Readiness, which is an important subcommittee of Senate Armed Services. So it's great to have you with us.
Thanks, Bill. Great to be here with all of you, and certainly look forward to the discussion.
And it's a good excuse for her not to be in New Hampshire, dealing with all these
problems. We've got this minor primary happening January 10th.
Do you want to say a few words about that first? I'm sure people would be interested. Why don't we begin? You are on the Armed Services Committee. You've been playing a role on a couple of the major issues, the defense issues, both the Defense Authorization Bill, which I guess came out of conference this morning, and on the issue of the sequester, which obviously looms large for people concerned about our defense readiness and preparedness. What's going to happen with sequester? What's going to happen in the defense budget?
Well, I think we need, with the failure of the super committee, we need to be concerned about what's going to happen with the sequester on defense. Just to remind everyone, under the Budget Control Act, the initial reductions are about $450 billion over the next 10 years to defense spending. And that was described by all the leaders of our military as very difficult but doable. So when you get to the point of sequester, which is another $600 billion over the 10 years to our defense spending, let's just put it in perspective of where we would be if that goes into effect. We would be in a position where our Navy would go back to the size it was in 1914. We would have, so basically the smallest Navy since 1914. We'd have the smallest ground force for our country since 1940, and the smallest air force in the history of our nation. We would, as this is all from Secretary Panetta, this would, in his view, destroy our industrial base. He's described the additional $600 billion in reductions as devastating, catastrophic, and shooting ourselves in the head, hollowing out our force. Need I add any more adjectives to tell everyone here how we have to make sure that that doesn't happen? And if you look even where we are right now in terms of defense spending as it relates to our GDP, we're between 4% and 5%. We are not, in fact, given the fact that we've been involved in 2 conflicts, we're actually historically low in terms of percentage to our GDP of where we are. And this issue is going to be a very important issue. I'll be working with Senator McCain, Senator Kyle, who served on the super committee, as well as Senator Graham. I think Senator Rubio is very interested in this issue as well, Senator Lieberman, of coming up with an alternative to the sequestration. I'm someone who firmly believes that the national debt, as former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Mullen, said, that this is the greatest threat to our national security. Absolutely. But we would be foolish to essentially subjugate our national security for our failure to take on the entire budget, including 60% of our spending, obviously entitlement spending, and reforming those programs as sustainable, making them sustainable going forward. So this is really a huge issue for us, one that I think you'll see a group of us working on to ameliorate and come up with other spending reductions over the next year.
When do you think this gets addressed? I mean, early in 2012?
I think early, very early, because here's the problem. I mean, if you look at when the reductions go into place, they don't actually come into place till going into 2013. But the issue is that in order to really make those kinds of significant reductions, it just doesn't happen overnight in the Department of Defense. And to come up with the initial $450 billion, they've been doing all kinds of planning, strategic thinking around it. And so acting now is very, very important because a lot of the decisions that would need to be made just don't all of a sudden come in 2013. So I expect that we'll make an announcement actually this week, that group, that we're going to be putting forward legislation, and this is an issue that we need to address immediately. And you also mentioned the issue of detainees. The Defense Authorization Bill came out of conference this morning, and one of the big fights, those of you that were following it on the Senate floor, was about the detainees and how we would treat detainees on the war on terror. And there was a bipartisan compromise that came out of the Senate Armed Services Committee, overwhelmingly, I would say, which had the support of Chairman Levin and Chairman McCain, which struck a balance. The reason that we came up with wanting to legislate in this area, I'm new to the Armed Services Committee, but over the last 9 months, I've been asking a series of questions along with others on the committee about, so if tomorrow we catch a high-value terrorist in Yemen, where are we going to put him? And I get answers from the commander of AFRICOM telling me I'd need lawyerly help to answer that question. There's just great operational uncertainty that have been created by the administration's policies in this area. And so the balance that came out of the Armed Services Committee is going to create a presumption of military custody for foreign members of al-Qaeda who are captured, who are seeking to attack our country, or those who are partnering with them to do so. But it provides broad national security waivers for the administration, also broad waivers for the FBI to be able to conduct its work. I think it's a good compromise and an area that cries out for some clarity. You know, thinking about where we are, 27% of those that we have released from Guantanamo have gotten back into the fight. The number 2 in al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. I mean, they're conducting suicide attacks. I can't imagine how our soldiers feel when they confront one of these guys that we had before out in theater, because this policy, there's also provisions in this that talks about what are the standards in looking at the reentry rate and recidivism in terms of releasing these individuals to third countries, which are very, very important because it's a huge, huge reentry rate from Guantanamo that we've got to address as well. And then fundamentally, the debate on the floor really came down to this. So are we at war or aren't we? And there are a viewpoint, and I think from having watched this administration and Attorney General Holder, comes at it from a viewpoint of criminalizing the war. So you have to ask yourself, what happened to us on September 11th? Should we treat those types of acts, those individuals, members of al-Qaeda, as in our criminal system as common criminals, or should we be treating them as individuals we're at war with? And I come down very firmly in the camp that we are at war with these individuals. My background is as an attorney general. I prosecuted murder cases. I have great respect for our criminal justice system, but it's not a system that was set up to gather intelligence. And so we need to be able to prioritize intelligence gathering so that, for example, there's been a lot of talk about the underwear of the Christmas bomber. We're fortunate that he was not part of a serial attack on our country. Because if he were, when he invoked his Miranda rights, his right to remain silent after 50 minutes of questioning, and we had to wait 5 weeks later after we found his parents in another country, brought him here, talked him into cooperating with us. Can you imagine what we would have lost if this was a series of events like 9/11? So we can't let that happen again, and that's what this whole debate was about. The administration has threatened to veto the defense authorization over the detainee provisions. We've done, I can tell you, from having been in direct discussions with members of the administration, along with obviously the more senior members of the committee, that we've done everything we can to accommodate their operational concerns, and we've put a lot of flexibility into the bill. So I'm hopeful that the President will rethink his position on this.
So that goes to the floor this week?
Yeah, well, it's not clear whether it'll be this week, but definitely before we go home.
And
Could be this week.
And you expect it to pass both bodies? And
it passed out of the Senate, the overall bill, even though we had a very robust debate on the detainee provisions, it passed 93 senators voted for it. So it's strong bipartisan support. And when you think about what you see happening in Washington, this is an area where broad bipartisan support. The Defense Authorization Bill passed out of the Armed Services Committee unanimously. How often does that happen around here? So I think this will get done.
And you think the president will sign it?
It's hard to veto a bill that 94 senators voted for, isn't it?
Don't ask me.
I mean, I have to say, truthfully, I dare him to.
Okay.
I mean, 94 senators voted for this, so this is an area where there's strong bipartisan support.
And it is interesting for all the talk about, partisan gridlock and nothing ever happens. The detainee issue, which in the beginning of this administration was one of the most fiercely fought about,
Right.
And I think legitimately fought about, because there were very different views about what to do. You do seem in the Senate actually to have, and I guess in the Congress as a whole, to have crafted what I think a lot of people would say is an improvement on current policy.
Right.
That has had bipartisan support in the Senate and may get the administration's agreement, which is, as you say, not the general picture people have of how things are working.
No, it's not insignificant, and it was truly a compromise. There are those of us, I'm in the camp, I would have gone much further in terms of meaning really in terms of military custody. I have a belief that when you're at war with us, that military custody really should be the starting point, and we gave them tremendous flexibility to waive those provisions.
Getting back to the defense spending issue just for a minute, I mean, it is striking for me on the outside. You have we had an $800 billion stimulus, none of which went, I think $4 billion, I think, went to defense out of $800 billion, even though from a classic Keynesian point of view, you might have thought if you just wanted to jumpstart the economy, a lot of Keynesians believe that the defense buildup for World War II helped end the Depression. The Defense Department is actually good at spending money. They have a lot of shovel-ready projects. They buy a lot of stuff which could be accelerated. I remember making this case the one time I ever, when he was president-elect, had a sort of serious conversation with President Obama when he reached out to some conservatives, something he quickly thought better of, I'd say, later when he became president. But, and I remember saying, look, I don't really agree with the whole stimulus idea, the way you've got it worked out, but if you're going to do one, why not at least do some spending on defense? I mean, we've exhausted. We have a big refit coming after the two wars. Everyone agrees that we've used up a huge amount of material. We have new generations coming on. And they were really startlingly resistant. As I say, even from a sort of their own point of view, you would have thought that they could have spent money effectively there.
Correct, because we do have to reset. And we're going to have to make that investment, or we're going to be in a position where we're not prepared for the next conflict. And I think we think about the fact that if you look at what happened after World War II, where we went from 19% of GDP spending on defense to 3.5%, and then we had the Korean War, and we have instances like Task Force Smith, where we've got, this is about real American lives, where people are killed because they don't have the proper equipment, they don't have the training. We haven't put ourselves in the position, and we can't be there again. But this would have been a smart investment for the president, because it's an investment we had to make anyway, and also would have been an area where we have the industrial base there. We know that if we reduce our defense industrial base, those are real jobs. And also, as we look forward to the sequestration issue, when the Secretary says that this is going to devastate our defense industrial base, once you do that, a lot of those small companies, they don't come back. It's difficult to get those back.
Yeah, a friend of mine said it's kind of stunning if you think about the president's first cabinet meeting. Literally every domestic cabinet secretary was told, give me every program you can spend money on, and then come back and give me some more, because we need to get so much money out the door, allegedly, to stimulate the economy. And Secretary Gates was told, begin to cut. And now, and I'm struck, you pick up the paper, and there's Secretary Panetta announcing the early layoffs, I think, was it 8,700 civilian employees of DOD, and somehow these other civilian agencies, which have expanded their employment considerably in the last 2 years, I haven't heard about any cutbacks there. It does seem a little just kind of bizarre, honestly, that defense is the one place we're cutting when we're fighting two wars, and when we didn't build it up in the last 2 years. But.
And it doesn't make sense to me, obviously, and I think the stimulus, I didn't agree with the stimulus as well. It was, truthfully, I think a lot of political giveaways in the stimulus, but didn't help our underlying economic growth. And particularly it would have made more sense to invest in an area where you know you're going to have to make the investment anyway and do it in a thoughtful way.
Do you think you can avert sequestration?
I do. I think that we will need to, and we will. But how that will happen around here is not always clear in the beginning. But I never cease to be amazed how a group of people can educate other senators, members of Congress, and then build a coalition to make sure it doesn't happen. And it seems to me that so many will be interested in this, given the grave consequences to our military and to our national security, that we will be able to build a bipartisan coalition at the end of the day to make sure that sequestration doesn't happen. That said, we've got to deal with the debt. We can't just say we're not going to allow sequestration to happen and not make the hard choices that need to be made to protect the future of this country. I mean, that is the looming threat to our country in terms of our economic growth, in terms of what we see happening in Europe right now is deeply troubling for our country. So I don't believe it should be used as an excuse not to make the tough decisions. It's just the defense shouldn't take the brunt of this. We've got 60% of the pie that has to be addressed.
Speaking of things happening on the Hill in real time, I guess last night there was an agreement on Iran sanctions.
Yes.
And you've been involved in that fight too?
Yes, absolutely. I think, the Kirk-Menendez amendment passed the Senate 100-0 in terms of coming down on the central bank, giving the administration authority to put in place very strong sanctions against the central bank of Iran. And the administration actually didn't want the amendment to go forward. They were concerned that it was actually too strong. But it shows the bipartisan support in Washington, and that language got included in the final defense authorization. So sending a very, very strong message that the Congress as a whole is, of course, concerned with what's happening in Iran, concerned about the acquisition of a nuclear weapon, nuclear proliferation by Iran, and also the consequences not only on Israel, obviously, which are very dire, but to the entire region of starting the nuclear arms race if Iran acquires a nuclear weapon. So I think that the administration is now going to have to follow through very strongly on this.
You will keep an eye on them?
We will. I think, when 100 senators vote for something, everyone will be keeping an eye on this. This is a huge issue and obviously a very important issue for the Israelis as well.
Iraq, Afghanistan, Senator Rubio talked a little bit about his worries about the complete withdrawal, I suppose, of U.S. military, the U.S. military from Iraq, and the failure to have any, as I understand it, any actual agreement governing what might happen going forward.
Yeah, I think, overall, if you look at, for a second, think about Iraq and Afghanistan together and the administration's policies toward both countries, the overall theme that you have to walk away from is ignoring the advice of our military commanders in terms of what we need to make sure that we don't lose the hard-fought gains that we've made and the success that we've had in Iraq, and also the progress that we're making in Afghanistan for the concerns about the upcoming 2012 elections. Because in both countries, Afghanistan, to have our military commanders, against the advice of every single military commander, the president is going to have the rest of the surge troops removed from Afghanistan before the 2012 elections, during the actual fighting season in Afghanistan. Not safe for our troops, not good for the progress we need to make there, and we're sending very, very mixed messages. And I think you can draw the same conclusion from Iraq, because when we've had the commanders come before the Armed Services Committee for a period of months leading up to this, what we heard from our commanders, from the administration, what you heard from General Austin, that he recommended, a minimum of 14,000 troops would remain going in after the end of this year, because we are not in a position unfortunately, Iraq is not in a position right now on air sovereignty, very big concerns on logistics. You've got issues in terms of tension in the north of Iraq, between the Kurds and obviously the Arabs, a very big concern. And then you've got the Shia militias also playing in the south and Baghdad. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, one of the things I'm really worried about is Iran's influence on Iraq, and that we've empowered Iran further by not pushing harder to make sure that we had an immunity agreement to keep that follow-on force in Iraq. Because if you think about the sacrifices we've made in Iraq to gain security there, and it really is poking a stick in the eye of Syria and Iran to have an emerging democracy between them. That's why they don't want this to happen. And so our national security interests are very important in what happens in Iraq. And I certainly share Senator Rubio's concerns about what's going to happen there, where we are at the moment. And look at the Maliki government also now purging out those that we had really reconciled with already. And that's going to cause further conflict. So this is a deeply troubling time. We need a president who is going to make these decisions not so that he can claim that before the 2012 election that we've withdrawn from Iraq, but based on what is in our national security interests in the long run. And I'm deeply concerned that he's put politics ahead of what is right for our country in both instances, in Iraq and Afghanistan.
And on that theme, in Afghanistan, I was there for the first time in October. Jamie and I and a small group went, and both General Allen and Ambassador Crocker really emphasized, and they've done this publicly, so I'm not saying anything I shouldn't be saying that was off the record, that while they thought they could manage the currently planned drawdown, though I think we all know that they did not recommend that we go all the way down to 68,000 troops, certainly not by October.
Well, you wouldn't do it in the middle of this fighting season.
season.
I mean,
no.
you don't, just doesn't make any sense to be doing two things at once. You're in the middle of a fighting season, then ask a whole host of our troops to leave at the same time.
Right, it's not as if they all leave on one day, so you
right, now they've
end
got to
up
plan the whole
really,
thing.
you know, spending half the fighting season drawing down in Helmand, I think, and elsewhere.
Right.
But what they did really emphasize very strongly, and I've been in government a little bit, and I would say I've rarely seen an ambassador and a ranking commanding general in command say this as forcefully, was that it's one thing, they think they can manage that, but that if a further drawdown is announced or ordered in 2012 for 2013, if they don't have the chance to stabilize the situation with 68,000 troops for a good year through 2013, they really think the mission would be put at risk. I think they've now said this publicly, but there's an awful lot of talk about the president wanting to announce a further drawdown, perhaps before the NATO summit, which I guess is in Chicago in May. I mean, you've obviously heard that. Do you have
I have heard that.
Do you have a sense of whether he's going to do that? Can you guys push him not to do it?
I've heard that as well. I'm deeply concerned about it. I think we, in the Armed Services Committee, have an opportunity, obviously, to, in the coming months before this May summit, to point out through the witnesses that come before our committee, and I plan to do that, to make the case as to why this would undermine our efforts in Afghanistan. And if you think about the message we've been sending, we think about Karzai and his actions, obviously a troubled leader, but at the same time, every time we make an announcement like we're going to withdraw, he then hedges his bets. And that's when you see him further trying to establish relationships with Iran, when you see it is to our detriment every time we signal to them that we're not committed to success in Afghanistan. And so I certainly plan, I know myself, I'm sure others on the committee will be making this case, and I'm hopeful in this instance that the president doesn't put politics above what is right and what should be done to protect our country. And Afghanistan is ground zero. We can't forget that do we want to put up with, are we prepared to put up with allowing that country to be a safe haven again for al-Qaeda? Are we? I don't think so. Do we want to have to go back after all the sacrifices we've been making? Or do we want to where we are now to push through and to see this thing through and have it succeed?
I'd like to ask you one more slightly philosophical question, and then we'll have time for a couple of questions from the floor. And I'm struck listening to you and to Senator Rubio, and having spoken to both of you some over the year that you've been here. I mean, contrary, I'd say, to the image of especially the younger Republicans, this, fiercely partisan, it seems to me that both of you have gone out of your way to try to work with the administration when possible, not to be excessively partisan or really partisan at all in many of your positions, to differ with the administration when you differ with them, but to give them the benefit of the doubt some of the time. On the other hand, obviously, you've said here, and it's you prefer to have a different president and a different administration. I'm just wondering how you found that balance as a freshman senator, and what surprised you or what you've learned in the Senate. I mean, do you find that there's more ability to work with the administration than you might have expected maybe at the second and third levels, or do you find it, I mean, how much should one be just despairing and denouncing this administration,
well,
and how much can one influence them to do something close to the right thing, even if it's not exactly what perhaps you would wish that they would do or I would wish that they would do?
I would say this, first of all, looking for opportunities to find the common ground is an important perspective to bring to it, because when it comes to issues of national security, I think I'd go back to our vote on the defense authorization in the Senate. These are issues where you actually can find bipartisan friends that surprise you at times, and looking for those opportunities, I certainly have. And I do find that dealing outside of the context of the top level individuals, but down within the administration, there are times you can get, particularly you think about our military, our commanders, there you really can get straight answers. They're often in a tough position as well. They report to a commander-in-chief, and they believe very much in the chain of command, but they also are wanting very much to make sure that our country is protected, so you can have some very good, straightforward discussions. And one thing I've found in the Senate is the committee work is very, very important on these issues. So, for example, on the detainee issue, for months I was questioning people about that issue. On the issue of what's happening in Iraq, when you think about it, the Secretary of Defense, Senator Graham asked Secretary Panetta, what's our national security interests in Iraq on a scale of 1 to 10? And he said it was an 8 or a 9. And so these are the kinds of questions I think that you can help move the administration through actually making a case and a record. And there are times when you can get them to listen to that. I think that we owe it to our country that country's always first, and particularly when it comes to our constitutional responsibility of protecting our country. So while I disagree with the administration on many issues, I will look for areas to make sure that we can work together to protect our country.
That's great. Time for a couple of questions. I think we have someone with mics. I can't. Why don't we go up here, and then we'll go back there and then up here, so that will be a little faster. Is there a mic back there? Yeah.
Ken Meyer from World Docs again. I feel the need for a clarification on this provision in the Defense Appropriations Bill concerning detainee policy, and I'm hopeful you can provide just a simple yes or no answer. Does the provision allow for the indefinite detention of American citizens arrested on American soil?
The provision recodifies what has been the law since the Inrig-Kieran decision in post-World War II. It does give the President the authority to detain an American citizen who fits within the category of the bill itself, a member of Al-Qaeda, also who is, I don't have the language, but basically you have to be a member of Al-Qaeda or associated group, and also participating in committing a belligerent act against our country. So this is not new law, recodifies what has already been the law of this land, going back to the Kieran decision, where it was a Nazi saboteur who was an American citizen who was captured on our soil, and allows for military detention. However, I want to clarify a few points, I think misperceptions about this. Number one, The detention provisions, the mandatory detention provisions in the bill itself do not apply to American citizens. They only apply to foreign members of al-Qaeda, number one. Congress has already made the decision that under the Military Commissions Act that an American citizen cannot be tried by a military commission. That has been a decision that Congress has made previously, so they can only be tried in a civilian trial. But if you do not have the detention authority, then you cannot question an American citizen who joins al-Qaeda and is seeking to kill Americans you have to give Miranda rights, you have to do all those things. You can't focus on intelligence gathering if the administration doesn't have that authority.
Was that a yes or a no?
Gentleman here.
Was that a yes
I
or a
would
no?
say,
You know.
yes, it does recodify what was already the law.
Thank you. Jonathan Broder from Congressional Quarterly. Mr. Kristol mentioned that you're working with Senators McCain and Graham and Rubio on trying to figure out a way to avoid sequestration. And you mentioned, I think, that the bill might be presented later this week.
Well, we are making an announcement. We're working on language, so we're not in a position to, I'm not in a position right here today to announce what that language will be, so we're still working that out. But I expect that we will make an announcement this week that we plan to introduce legislation. Whether we'll have the legislative language available this week, I do not know yet.
I was wondering if you just in general, without getting into very, very specific detail, if you could give us an idea of the kind of thoughts you're thinking about to try to accomplish this goal of
well, there are two areas we're looking at. And so, as I said, the language has not been in place and we have not negotiated the details. What we've agreed is that we would like to come up with other spending cuts to avoid the sequestration. And that is two different ways you can look at it. You can look at it as across the board cut. What does that do as an across the board cut rather than focusing on one area? And including cuts, I mean, Senator Graham has come up with the idea of also cuts to our pay as well, included in that. And the other way you can look at it is Senator Kyle, there was a lot of work done, particularly leading up to the debt ceiling, as well work that was given to the super committee, and that all of cuts that could come up, reductions that we could do. So there's been a tremendous amount of work done there that hasn't been adopted, and taking that work and growing upon it. So there hasn't been an agreement on the group which way we would directly go, but those are two areas where we're working on legislative language and we're going to work it out. There are areas that leading up to the debt ceiling discussions, as you know, and then also leading up to the super committee, there was a lot going back and forth in the super committee of areas where you could reduce spending, and taking that work to actually bring it forward in a bill, I think, would be a good way to go.
So you are going to seek to substitute other cuts, in effect, for the automatic cuts?
Absolutely. It will be a substitute for the automatic cuts, so that's what it'll be. So what the final version is, I can't commit to right now because there's a whole host of senators involved. And
go right ahead. They won't mind. Really.
Yeah, sure.
You know.
But just one
that's when the freshman gets kicked out of the group.
Can one presume that they would be coming mostly from entitlements?
No, I wouldn't presume that, and we haven't clarified that yet. So I would wait, obviously, to see what the final language is. I would say this, that we will come up with the reductions in a way that doesn't trigger the sequester, but what configuration that will be right now, I'm not in a position to give you the specifics on it.
We should let Senator Ayotte go back to, I think you have a Republican conference lunch, don't you, very shortly, and she has to give Senator McConnell his marching orders. So we
actually, and then we have a leadership election, so.
Oh, is that right? Oh, that's right.
Yeah, we do.
What's going to happen in that? Go ahead, make some news.
I know better than to predict the leadership election. How's that?
Thank you so much for coming, and
Thanks.
really for a very thoughtful
Appreciate it.
discussion.
Thank you.